Chapter 7. Lowe's First Mission. On February 11, 1942, the U-505 and the veteran U-68 sailed from Lorient. The U-505 on her first war mission and the U-68 on her fifth. Escorted by a minesweeper to the 100-fathom curve, they parted there to proceed independently as lone wolves to their assigned hunting ground off Freetown, just above the equator, in the Big Bulge on the west coast of Africa. The shipping lanes for traffic going round the Cape of Good Hope passed close to Freetown, and there was lots of traffic going that way now. The battle for Egypt was raging along the northern rim of the Sahara Desert, with Rommel and the British chasing each other back and forth from Benghazi to El Alamein. The Mediterranean was practically closed to Allied shipping, and all supplies for the British Army had to go clear around Africa. Dönitz, keeping a shrewd eye on shipping and on the deployment of Allied naval and air forces, had found a spot off Freetown with heavy traffic and weak defenses. The hunting would be good here. As Captain Lieutenant Axel Lowe took the U-505 to sea for her first raiding mission, he had every reason to look forward eagerly to the future. He had a splendid new U-boat and a crew which he had trained himself. His orders to operate as a lone wolf gave him an independent command and made him the master of his own destiny, as much as it is possible to be such on this earth. He had reached the top spot to which any young German could aspire at this point in the world history, and had a better opportunity to win fame than any of his contemporaries in the army or even in the Luftwaffe. Within a few months, he might be a hero of the fatherland, like Prien, the giant killer, who sank the Royal Oak. Prien was now a corpse on the bottom of the sea, put there by the little Wolverine, a mere spitkit compared to the Royal Oak. But Lowe didn't let his mind dwell on things like that. All aviators expect to die in bed, and so do U-boat skippers starting off on their first cruise. Lowe had 19 torpedoes on board, and it only took 50,000 tons of enemy ships sunk to win an Iron Cross. If he was lucky, if most of his torpedoes hit, and if his targets were average-sized ships, he might make it on this cruise. Hessler and the U-107 had sunk 90,000 tons on one cruise. The U-68, now also en route to Freetown, was already well on her way to 100,000 tons and a Knight's Cross for her skipper. The luck of the chase would, of course, play a big part in the score that Lowe would make on this cruise. But he had drawn a good hunting ground, so his own guts, skill, and intuition would play a big part too. Every U-boat skipper who ventured out of Biscay was crossing the doorstep of destiny, and Lowe must have had a few dreams of glory as he stood his night's watches on the bridge, working his way south. The crew were just as anxious as the skipper to get into action. Up to now, Germany was certainly winning the war, and none of them doubted final victory. They were anxious to play a part in it, which they could brag about in later years. Members of famous U-boat crews were great heroes in Germany now. During their 8-day stay in Lorient, the unproven crew of the U-505 had been tolerantly patronized by the combat veterans of the U-68, U-124, U-515, and some of the other famous boats. With a little luck, they would be able to do some patronizing themselves next time they were in Lorient. For the first 2 days out of Lorient, Lowe crept along at low speed, submerged all day, and ran at high speed on the surface at night. Then, with about 400 miles between him and the RAF bases in England, he ran surfaced all the time, except for about an hour a day of proof dives and drills. At this time, the proposition that Britannia ruled the waves and the air over them was merely a patriotic idea in the minds of some old-fashioned Englishmen. A bold, eager beaver like Lowe, who had confidence in his lookouts, could cruise on the surface any time he felt so inclined. As we shall see when the U-505 headed for Freetown the next time, 2 years later, it would be quite a different story. The one thing that the new U-boat, its captain, and the crew needed to finally fuse them into an effective combat unit was a successful brush with the enemy. No matter how well a new ship does at drills, these are make-believe affairs. Until the chips are down and you play for keeps, you can never be sure that there isn't a weak sister aboard who will get butterfingered when his life is at stake. The U-505's first chance to prove herself came within 2 weeks when she was passing west of the Cape Verde Islands. At 4:30 in the afternoon, on February 24, Lowe sighted a smoke cloud over 20 miles to the east. When he tried to close it, he soon found it came from a fast southbound convoy, making 15 knots. Such a convoy would have been hard to catch in any event, because running on the surface, the U-505 could make a little over 18 knots. When you are trying to close 20 miles on a convoy, holding a position abeam of it, as you must to make a successful attack, 3 knots margin in speed is just barely enough. But in this case, the convoy had air escort, and Lowe was driven under several times when the planes made routine sweeps out in his direction. Apparently, the planes never saw him, but their approach forced him to submerge. His submerged speed began only 3 or 4 knots at best. He lost distance on the convoy rapidly whenever he was driven down. Lowe hung on till 1 o'clock the next morning, by which time he still was 20 miles from the convoy, but had dropped astern of them. Then he lost the convoy in the darkness, and he surmises in his war diary that the convoy made a sudden change of course to the east, which he failed to detect. He also records for the information of his superiors, "My fault that we lost contact." This sheds a lot of light on the man's character, because all his superiors could ever know about this episode was what Lowe told them. And he could easily have told them a better story to explain his first failure if he had been built that way. Of course, the crew knew pretty well what was going on during this 10.5-hour chase, and it really wasn't the skipper's fault that this convoy had escaped. They knew you can't always attack every target you sight. A lot depends on the speed of the target and your position relative to its course when you first pick it up. If there are airplanes buzzing around the convoy, you'll only get in a shot if your first sighting happens to be in a lucky position. So the crew of the U-505 didn't blame their skipper for the convoy's escape. But they still needed their first kill, and Lowe knew very well that you don't build morale on good alibis for missed opportunities. But sometimes you can build it on strange things. Next morning, a lookout sighted a Sunderland bomber near the horizon about 5 miles away. "Alarm! Flugzeug!" he cried, and the 4 lookouts plopped down the hatch into the conning tower. The watch officer pulled the diving alarm, and the whole boat galvanized into action. Both diesels coughed to a stop as the Maschinenmatten spun their throttle valves and slammed the main air induction shut. Electricians threw in the switches on the big board in the motor room, and the whine of electric motors replaced the throbbing of diesels as the shafts kicked over again. "Ready to dive," bawled the watch officer as he dropped from the bridge into the conning tower, pulling the hatch down over his head. On the level below in the control room, men stood tensely at the flooding and vent manifolds, their hands on the valves, ready to go into the routine that would take her down. "Achtung!" barked the diving officer, and made a signal with his right hand. The men began spinning valve wheels in a carefully predetermined sequence. The boat had been riding on the vents, which means the sea valves in the bottom of all ballast tanks were open, but the air vent valves in the top were closed. Seawater had therefore entered all tanks through the open sea valves, compressing the air trapped in the top of the tanks until the air pressure equaled the sea pressure and the water stopped coming in. All ballast tanks were about half full of water, and the boat was, in effect, being kept on the surface by the cushions of air trapped in the top of each ballast tank. To take her down, all they had to do was to pop the vents open. The air would whoosh out. The water would surge in through the bottom, and down they would go. You get under a little quicker if you nose the boat down about 10 degrees in the process. So it was standard procedure on U-505 to pop the forward vents open first, letting water in forward to trim the bow down, and then pop the after vents. Meantime, the men on the diving planes watched the bubbles in their inclinometers and wrestled with the big wheels on the forward and after diving flippers to keep the boat at the desired angle. A dozen operations must be performed at exactly the right instant to make a good crash dive retaining full control of the boat. When they are, your boat is completely submerged in about 35 seconds. She has leveled off at about 40 meters. The bubbles are centered, the trim tanks adjusted, and you settle down for a normal, submerged run. This time, on the U-505, there was a slight hitch. Willie Bunger, an 18-year-old farm boy on the afterballast tank vents, missed a signal and didn't pop his vents open when he should have. Willie knew that if necessary he should open his vents at a certain point without further signal after the diving officer gave the order. Take her down. But always in the past the diving officer had motioned with his left hand when he wanted the aftervents. He did this time too, but Willie didn't see it, and the diving officer failed the check. Willie waited about 10 seconds too long before popping the vents on his own initiative. As a result, for 15 or 20 seconds, water was pouring into the tanks, up forward, but none was coming in aft. This made the boat very nose-heavy. As Lowe climbed into the conning tower, the boat had just reached its normal 10-degree nose-down trim. "Sunderland aircraft, 5 miles bearing 270, Capitan," reported the watch officer. "Very well," said Lowe. "Hold her at this angle." The angle increased to 15 degrees. "Bow planes full up, stern planes full down," barked the watch officer. The angle increased to 20 degrees. The diving officer checked quickly to see that the after-vents were open. And by this time, they were. "Close forward vents," he yelled. Normally, this would have straightened things out fast. The inrush of water up forward would stop. Water would continue to pour in aft, and proper balance would soon be restored. But Willie Bunger had waited so long before popping his vents that by the time he did it, the stern was clear out of the water, and the after flood valves were a foot above the water. Instead of more water coming into the after tanks, the water already in them was gurgling out. When he opened the vents, it just made things worse by letting the water pour out faster. Down, down, down went the bow. At 30 degrees, Lowe shot a glance at the depth indicator, saw that it still read 0, and realized immediately what was happening. The boat was pivoting around the conning tower, with the bow going under and the stern coming out of the water. "Osblazin'," he yelled, taking over from the diving officer. "Blow all tanks." As the shafts began to race, he added, "Stop motors." High air pressure to expel water from all tanks began hissing through the boat, but she kept right on tilting till she was 40 degrees nose down. Before she reached that angle, the men and all loose gear started sliding along the floor plates and piled up against the forward bulkhead in each compartment, making the boat more bow-heavy. Water was still pouring out of the after tanks faster than it was being forced out of the forward ones. For 2 minutes, in order to stand erect, Lowe had to brace one foot on the forward vertical bulkhead and one on the deck of the conning tower. A few more degrees increase in trim would have forced him to shift both feet to the bulkhead. Any instant he expected to feel the smashing impact of bombs from the Sunderland. Finally, the increasing trim stopped. The boat hovered at a crazy angle for half a minute, and then began settling back again. When she was within 10 degrees of being level again, Lowe barked, "Cut off the air, open all vents and valves, start motors." The U-505 settled back in the ocean. Water rushed in equally forward and aft, and the boat disappeared under the sea. To all hands in the crew it seemed that their heartbeats had stopped, and they hadn't breathed for 5 minutes as they were waiting for the blows from the air which hadn't come. Now, at 40 meters on an even keel, everyone let out a sigh, looked at each other silently, and relaxed. In Lowe's war diary, the following entry appears. Ein schadenhaft Situation, Gott sei Dank hat das Flugzeug nicht gischen. A liberal translation is, "A hell of a fix. Thank God the plane didn't see us." 10 minutes after getting squared away again, Lowe and the diving officer had reconstructed the whole sequence of events and figured out why it had happened. "Tell Bunger I want to see him," said Lowe. Willie Bunger was in his bunk, his face buried in the mattress and his whole body quaking when they shook him and said, "The captain wants to see you now." Willie sat up slowly, holding his head in his hands, trying to conceal the tears, but he couldn't do it. "I can't help it," he sobbed, looking at his shipmates miserably. "It was all my fault." "Ja," said his friends, "but no harm done. The captain—" Willie pulled himself together, dried the tears on his skivvy shirt, and made his way forward to the conning tower. "Seaman Bunger, sir," he said, snapping to attention. Lowe looked narrowly at the bloodshot eyes and tear-stained face. "Well?" he said. "It was all my fault, sir," blurted Willie. "I missed a signal and—" Willie choked up and began crying again. After a pause, Lowe asked, "Did you do it on purpose?" "No, Capitan," said Willie. "Will you ever do it again?" "No, Herr Capitan," said Willie emphatically. "Gut," said Lowe. "We must have looked very funny with our head in the water and our ass up in the air, like an ostrich." Even Willie couldn't stop an embarrassed grin at this absurd picture. "Go below and get some coffee, Wilhelm," said Lowe. Although only the captain and Willie had been present in the conning tower during the interview, every word spoken was known to every man in the boat within a very few minutes. Each one of them said within himself, "I must be careful not to fail this captain." From that day forward, Willie Bunger responded cheerfully to the nickname Ostrich and never made another mistake on the vents. On March 2nd, the U-505 arrived in her assigned area off Freetown, and 3 days later, at 6:30 in the evening, on the 5th, the lookout sighted a 6,000-ton cargo ship, 120 miles offshore, bound for Freetown. This time, Lowe was lucky. The ship had no escort. It was just before sunset when he sighted her, and he could remain on the surface and make his attack under cover of darkness. For 4 hours he stalked her deliberately, and just before 11 p.m. he fired his first torpedoes at a live target. A double shot from the bow tubes at point-blank range of 600 yards. They both missed. But a third shot didn't. It hit the unsuspecting steamer smack amidships, and she coasted to a stop, sending out a frantic SOS, saying, "SS Ben Moore torpedoed," and giving her position. The U-505 had finally tasted blood. In the light of a nearly full moon, Lowe waited while the Ben Moore got her boots in the water, and then plunked her with another torpedo that broke her back and sunk her. He then made off on the surface at high speed, leaving the lifeboats to make the best of their way ashore. The ship had gotten off an SOS, and on such a fine moonlight night, there might be planes out there any minute. So it was advisable to get away from the scene of the sinking. In fact, 3 hours after the sinking, they had to crash dive to avoid a Sunderland, obviously sent out in response to the Ben Moore's SOS. The SOS had given Lowe all the information he needed for his sinking report, and that night he entered in his war diary, 5342, English Fractor Ben Moore, 6,000 BRT. From the point of view of a U-boat skipper and his crew, the above terse entry contains all the information of any importance in connection with an incident such as this one. It is not quite as simple as that for the survivors in the lifeboats. But if they are only 120 miles from Freetown in good weather, the outlook isn't too grim. If they are in the middle of the Atlantic, that's something else, and they have an ordeal to go through before they can be sure they are survivors. As the U-505 steamed off to the southwest from the scene of her first kill, she was a different U-boat, and every man in the crew a new man. Up till now, they had been on trial, but hadn't proven themselves. Despite that diploma from the Admiral in the Baltic, they were still virgins at the trade of sinking ships. Now they had come up with a clean kill, and wouldn't have to be bashful anymore in the presence of the older crews of the second flotilla around the bars in Lorient. It was a jubilant group of novices that had tasted their first blood that night. They found it a heavy drink. Their next swig of it came sooner than they had any right to expect. At 9:30 the next morning, only about 45 miles from the spot where they had sunk Ben Moore, They sighted a heavily laden tanker, also inbound for Freetown. She was zigzagging radically, evidently had been warned about the sinking of the Ben Moore. In this same area, a few hours before, it didn't take Lowe and his navigator long to analyze the zigzag and determine that she was headed for Freetown and that they were right on her base course. Lowe submerged and waited for her devious path to bring her in front of his tubes. And 2 hours later, she lined herself up with his periscope crosshairs. He fired a double shot at her as she disappeared in a rain squall and heard 2 explosions at the time his torpedo should have hit. 10 minutes later, when the squall lifted, there was nothing but a huge cloud of smoke where the tanker had been. Lowe surfaced and approached the cloud, noting that the water was covered with oil and wreckage, and finally spotting 2 rafts in a lifeboat. He came close enough to the rafts to determine that the survivors were all soaked with oil, and that some were burned and needed medical supplies. But as he prepared to go alongside and give them morphine, salve, and bandages, the lookouts sighted an airplane. He had to submerge and get out of the area. The entry in the log for that day's work was 6.3.42, English tanker, name unknown, 8,000 BRT. The sinking of 14,000 tons in 2 days started dreams of glory dancing in every head on the U-505. They had 13 torpedoes left, and if they kept on at this rate, the torpedoes would soon be gone, and they would be on their way home to get iron crosses at the end of their first cruise. They told themselves they were no longer mere novices with only 1 kill. They could go now strut through the bars and bistros of Lorient, using the plural when they spoke of their kills. They had twisted the tail of the British Lion, 4,000 miles from home, out in the ocean. That Britannia was supposed to rule. They regarded themselves now as seasoned U-boat veterans. But Lowe, although pleased at these first 2 successes, knew that he and his crews hadn't really been tested yet. They were all still apprentices, and would be until they got shaken up. There is nothing heroic about sinking a couple of unescorted merchant ships, any more than there is in shooting ducks. It requires a certain amount of technical know-how in operating the boat, alertness by the lookouts to spot the game, and skill in adjusting and aiming the torpedoes. But it is no real test of the crew's ability to perform under pressure. That would come later, when exploding depth charges slugged the hull with stunning blows, when each man had to grit his teeth, brace himself, and find the right valves in the dark with the whole ocean quaking around him. Actually, it was Lowe's duty to postpone this testing as long as possible. His job was to make his attacks so that the enemy had the least possible chance of doing any harm to him. The more one-sided and certain he made this business of sinking unescorted merchant ships, the better he was doing his job. In submarine operations, as in all fields of military endeavor, the ideally planned and executed operation is an ambush where you kill the enemy from a position of complete safety yourself. A commander who takes any unnecessary risk is a fool. Submarine warfare is a business in which the advantages are all on either one side or the other, and the odds can change quite suddenly from one extreme to the other. The very nature of a submarine requires it to operate by stealth, and so long as it remains undetected until its torpedo blows the bottom out of an unsuspecting victim, the odds are all in the sub's favor. Even Preen's great and daring feat of sinking the Royal Oak depended on stealth and surprise. But the moment a destroyer or an aircraft spots a sub, the odds swing the other way. A sub's only real defense is to submerge and make itself invisible. The first convoy the U-505 had sighted, just after leaving Biscay, got away simply because an aircraft circling around it forced the sub to submerge and hide. Submarines seldom get into a fight, properly speaking, except when cornered. A fight is a two-way battle in which the opponents stand up to each other and slug. Submarines are supposed to roll with the enemy's punch, dodge and squirm, and to get away rather than counterpunch. Even the wolf packs, which charged into convoys on the surface at night, did so under cover of darkness, depending on surprise and confusion to enable them to hit and run. I don't mean to imply that the U-boat crews were not brave men. They were, but they had a different kind of courage from the kind we usually associate with military exploits. Their courage was tested not by the sinking of helpless merchant ships, for which they got their medals, but by the uneventful weeks of prowling in enemy waters between sinkings when nothing was happening. Then they had to learn how to live with the constant knowledge that sudden and gruesome death might be lurking just beyond the horizon. Even if they went for months without encountering enemy opposition, this was no guarantee that in the next 10 minutes they might not be fighting for their lives, struggling to bring their boat to the surface and get overboard before her battered hull went to the bottom. Lowe knew that it took a few depth charges close aboard to sort out the men from the boys in his crew, and finally make the U-505 a tested veteran. After sinking the tanker, Lowe patrolled back and forth across the shipping lane from Freetown to Cape of Good Hope, eager for the next victim. But for the next 10 days, he had the whole ocean to himself, and his jubilant crew had to settle down again to the tedious monotony of routine life at sea in a submarine. Landlubbers who spend their lives ashore where they have plenty of elbow room and can have all the privacy they want any time they feel grumpy, find it hard to believe that 60 men can live together for 3 months inside a pressure hole no bigger than a subway car. It's a cramped, confined life, in which all hands get to know each other much too well. But so is life in a monastery or a prison. Men can get used to it, and counting all navies of the world, perhaps 100,000 men did it in World War II. When you are on patrol and the hunting is bad, one day is almost exactly the same as the others. In fact, you could simplify the calendar by boiling the week down to 3 days: yesterday, today, and tomorrow. The 60 men who got to sea together in a sub have got to make more personality adjustments than most psychiatrists have ever heard of. Before the cruise is over, every man on board will know every joke that every other man on board has ever heard. He will listen to plenty of bragging by his shipmates about their amatory exploits, and probably do some himself. To 3 or 4 intimates, he may let down his hair and tell them what he really thinks. But although plenty of serious thinking is done on a long cruise, little of it comes out in words. A garrulous deep thinker would be a menace to the morale of a group who knows they are never sure of half an hour to live. Raconteurs are what you need on a U-boat, not philosophers. A screwball character who isn't screened out of the crew soon enough can make life hell for all on board, including himself, for one cruise. A claustrophobe would, of course, be unthinkable. A sub would be a literal madhouse for him and all his shipmates. The longest walk you can take is 200 feet in a narrow passageway, from the forward to the after torpedo room. With 60 men living practically in each other's laps, little things assume great importance, and an irritating personal quirk that might be overlooked ashore can quickly antagonize all your shipmates. Snoring is frowned on by the men in adjacent bunks. By adjacent, I mean just high enough above and below each other so that the man in the middle bunk barely has room enough to roll over. If you slurp your soup too loud at the chow table, the guy who sits next to you for 90 days may want to strangle you at the end of the first month. You can make lifelong enemies by occupying the gents' can for more than your fair share of time. This, incidentally, is the only place on a U-boat where anyone is ever alone, all by himself, except for the skipper, who can pull a curtain across the door of his cubbyhole cabin and pretend he is getting some privacy. Everybody has got to allow for some weaknesses in each of the others, and to keep his own weaknesses, which the others must allow for, to a minimum. I don't mean to say that a sub-crew gets along together like nuns in a convent, but every man on board has got to get along fairly well with every other. There just isn't room enough in a sub for any real personality clash, and if one occurs, the skipper will probably transfer both offenders at the end of that cruise. As long as your shipmates feel that you are willing to give as much as you take, you will be accepted. If they ever feel otherwise about it, you are in bad trouble, and soon learn the meaning of massive retaliation. When your shipmates turn against you, you can be just as lonely on a crowded submarine as if you were marooned on a desert island. A thief on a submarine is simply unthinkable, and so is a sex pervert, because there is no place to hide. I've heard of a man on a sub during the war who didn't think it was safe to leave his money behind on the paymaster's books in Pearl Harbor when he went off on a war patrol to Japan. He drew $1,200 in cash the last day in port and kept it in his clothes locker on the sub. Everybody lives in a goldfish bowl, and any unusual event in the after-torpedo room, such as Schmidt losing his watch, is known immediately in the forward torpedo room. An unusually funny quip or noteworthy comment of any kind gets through the boat almost as fast as if it had been said on the public announcing system. For this reason, you had better not go off half-cocked in any comment you make if it can affect the peace and harmony of the boat, because what you say will eventually get to the skipper if you are out of line. Under some circumstances, the crew can tell the skipper gently but firmly something which he ought to know. A new skipper on one of our veteran subs in the Pacific muffed his first attack because he stuck the attack periscope up too far out of the water, and his prospective victim spotted it and got away. For the next day or so, he overheard snatches of conversations mentioning a nickname, which he didn't recognize as belonging to anyone in the boat. Finally, he asked one of the chiefs, "Who is this guy I hear the boys calling Old Totem Pole?" The chief had to tell him, and he never stuck his periscope up too far again. Bathing facilities are primitive on a U-boat. There is no such thing as a bathtub, although you can take a saltwater shower in the cooling water for the diesel engines after it has done its cooling and is maybe too damn hot to interest you. A sub must make her own fresh water by distilling seawater, which uses up her precious fuel supply or battery. Fresh water is carefully rationed, and each man in the crew gets half a bucket per day. After a while, you learn to brush your teeth, shave, scrub your clothes, and take a sort of a bath every now and then in half a bucket of water. You don't have to be too particular about bathing, because when everybody smells a little bit gamey, nobody gets too much of a fisheye unless he is really ripe. Our submariners say, if you think you smell someone standing behind you, but you find nobody there, then you better take a bath. Space is at such a premium on a U-boat that they can't provide a bunk for each man. As soon as one man gets out of a bunk, another one crawls in. This is known as the hot bunk system. At the start of a cruise, with all torpedoes on board, the upper bunks have torpedoes stowed in them. Some bunks are shared by 3 men, being occupied around the clock. Officers double up in a stateroom with upper and lower bunks. In accordance with the long-standing custom of the sea, the captain lives in solitary grandeur in a private cabin. He has a desk, wash bowl, locker, and bunk, all jammed into a space 6 feet square. But at least he has it all to himself, and is therefore the only man on board who can have some privacy when he wants it. Of course, he is always alone with his indivisible responsibility, and probably often wishes he could share that with somebody. The galley on the U-505 was little bigger than a telephone booth. It had a 3-burner stove on which all the cooking was done for 60 men. The food was good. The very best that Germany could produce was given to the U-boats. What to do with spare time is quite a problem on a submarine. You can't just sit around thinking during off-duty hours, and there is certainly no use in writing letters home. Whenever possible, a skipper will run close enough to the surface to stick up a whip antenna and get the radio news broadcasts. It helps relieve the hemmed-in feeling of isolation to hear what is happening elsewhere on this planet. Most U-boats carried a record player, which they could hook into the loudspeaker circuits. By the end of one cruise, the discs would be worn out and the melodies etched into the brains of the crew for the rest of their lives. Books and magazines were read over and over until they became dog-eared. Decks of cards continued in use long after they were worn out, and checkers and chess were popular pastimes. Any military man from a spit and polish outfit would be shocked by a brief glimpse inside a submarine after it settles down on a war patrol. When he recovered enough to talk, he would certainly announce that this was a ragtime, undisciplined outfit. He would be wrong on the discipline part. No U-boat lives long unless its crew is thoroughly trained to instant and precise obedience. But life is a bit on the informal side in submarines. Military protocol is sketchy, and when on patrol, U-boat sailors looked more like pirates than members of the Third Reich's Kriegsmarine. All who could grew beards. Their mops of uncut hair would stuff a couple of mattresses. You could make a pretty fair guess as to how long a U-boat had been away from base when you fished its survivors out of the water, from the length of the crew's hair. The uniform of the day for a sub in the tropics was sneakers and a pair of drawers. When 60 men live as close together as a U-boat crew does, you don't need any insignia of rank to tell the others who you are. And when all you wear is a pair of skivvy pants, it cuts down the laundry problem. So conventional uniforms went into the lockers when they left Lorient and didn't come out again until they came alongside the dock to be received by the Admiral on return. On U.S. submarines, even the officers went around in skivvies. After 10 days of the yesterday, today, and tomorrow routine, Lowe finally spotted another steamer early one morning. It was unescorted but zigzagging radically. Lowe stalked it for 7 hours, maneuvering on the surface just beyond the steamer's horizon to get into a position ahead of a good shot. At mid-afternoon he submerged, closed in for the kill, and fired a double shot. Both shots missed because the ship took an unexpected zig directly away from him just as he fired. The water was glassy and the steamer may have spotted his periscope just in time. At any rate, he had to back off beyond the horizon, surface, and maneuver for firing position again. Had this happened at night, he could have regained position quickly on the surface. Several hours later, when he had worked around ahead of the steamer again, an airplane appeared, forcing him to submerge prematurely, and the steamer got away. This futile day's work highlights the fact that U-boat operations depended completely on stealth. Whenever a prospective victim saw the U-boat more than a minute or so before a torpedo hit, she simply had to turn away to frustrate the attack. The sub would then have a long haul getting into position for another attack. Note, the acoustic homing torpedo later changed this. The escape of the steamer after the aircraft arrived on the scene also points up the fact that boats like the U-505 were essentially surface vessels. Whenever they had to stay submerged any length of time, their victims got away. For the next 12 days, the only events to break the monotony were several crash dives in the daytime to escape planes which the U-boat's alert lookout sighted before the plane saw them. Theoretically, a plane can see a submarine much farther away than the sub's lookout can see the plane. And in peacetime maneuvers, they usually do. But it often happens the other way in wartime, because a sub's lookouts have a much greater incentive for alertness than the plane's lookouts. When the plane sees the U-boat first and sinks it, everybody in the plane gets a medal, but everybody in the U-boat usually gets killed. Lowe's lookouts also sighted a corvette on the horizon, but since she was all alone and proceeded at high speed, Lowe maneuvered to avoid her. His major mission was to sink merchant ships, and he could not afford to waste fuel getting in position to pick a fight with a small but deadly warship. March 28 began like any other routine today, but turned out to be an unusual one. Shortly after midnight on that day, the British made a daring naval raid on St. Nazaire, aimed at destroying the only dry dock in France that could take the great battleship Tirpitz. They broke into the inner harbor with the ex-U.S. destroyer Campbelltown and rammed her into the dockgate, where she remained with her bow wedged fast until the next afternoon. Then, while many German engineering experts were aboard trying to figure out how to get her out of there, preset time fuses solved the problem for them by blowing her to smithereens and scattering pieces of highly trained experts all over the outskirts of St. Nazaire, putting the dock out of commission for the rest of the war. This was very embarrassing to the Germans, and especially to Dönitz and his staff. Hitler had promoted Dönitz to 4-star rank only a few days before, and Dönitz had sent a nice message to all his U-boat commanders saying that this was in recognition of their efforts. The daring British attack caught him with his new 4-star pants down. It has long been a superstition in the U.S. military forces that the general staff system, employed by all the German armed forces, including the Navy, renders it impossible for a commander to make small mistakes. If subordinates stick to the system and clear everything through channels, the only bloopers they can ever make will be colossal ones, such as those which lost World Wars I and II. But the U-505's War Diary for March 28 reveals that even the famed General Staff system can slip a cog when somebody pushes the panic button. Right after the Campbelltown barged into the dock gate, a jittery staff officer in Dönitz headquarters jumped to the conclusion that the British were making a major landing and released an urgent radio saying, "All U-boats east of 29 degrees west proceed toward Lorient at high speed." On the U-505, 3,000 miles away off Cape Palmas in Africa, they woke Low up at 3 a.m. and handled him this dispatch. His longitude was 20 degrees west, so this was a peremptory order from Dönitz, telling him to head for Lorient. It was obviously meant only for boats in the Bay of Biscay, but this was Low's first command, and he didn't feel justified in reading between the lines. He felt it necessary to send a radio to U-boat headquarters, referring to the panic message and saying in effect, "Who? Me?" By the time this query got to headquarters, order had been restored, and he got a prompt reply telling him to remain on station. Captain Lieutenant Merton, in the nearby U-68, being a veteran skipper, had merely dismissed the panic message with a contemptuous comment on Cherbourne's strategist ashore, and gone on about his business. When things quieted down in St. Nazaire, Dönitz, whose communiques were usually pretty factual, sent out a message to his U-boats recorded in U-505's War Diary, saying, "British attack driven off." This is quite comparable to the communiques of all governments after an air raid I had blasted one of their cities off the map. And when the enemy bombers were finally going home, the enemy aircraft were driven away. I relate this incident because some U.S. military officers have been trying for years to persuade Congress that if we will adopt the general staff system in this country, we will all live happily ever after. Later on that day, Low got sucked into a succession of incidents that nearly lost him a few tail feathers. Twice after sunset on the 28th, he had to crash dive to avoid aircraft. Just before midnight, he sighted another aircraft and a corvette. Sniffing around the area to find where they were. Sniffing around the area to find out why there was so much activity, he finally spotted a large merchant ship headed for Freetown. Maneuvering on the surface in the moonlight, he was just getting into position to shoot when the steamer suddenly headed right at him as if to ram. He had to crash dive and let her pass over him, thus putting him astern of her where it was useless to fire torpedoes. Apparently, this was a chance maneuver by the steamer, and she hadn't actually seen him. He surfaced and trailed for about 4 hours, waiting for the moon to set. But again, an aircraft drove him down and must have seen him and called the corvette back from its position ahead of the ship. Soon Low's soundman reported, "High-speed screws approaching," and a little later, "Sonar pulses growing louder." This was it. Now he was the quarry instead of the hunter, and would soon find out what his crews were made of. His only defense was evasion. He couldn't use his torpedoes without exposing himself to almost certain destruction. Low took her down to 600 feet, slowed to creeping speed, and an expectant hush came over the boat. At a time like this, the men in that steel cigar, 100 fathoms below the surface, are on the threshold of eternity with their lives in the hands of one man, the skipper. There must be many thoughts racing through their minds, but there is only one in the skipper's mind: escape. All hands in the sub can hear the increasing noise of the enemy's propellers as he approaches the firing point and the decreasing beat as he passes it. There follows an interval of perhaps half a minute while the depth charges are sinking when everyone braces himself. And almost everyone, no matter what his background, prays and promises God he will do better from now on if. Then suddenly, massive sledgehammer blows slug the hull. That is the old man with the scythe on his shoulder knocking on their hideaway and demanding admittance. He pounds like a lusty young giant. The steel hull transmits each shock to the very marrow of every man's bones. But unless the explosions are very close indeed, all they do is smash the lights, jar large flakes of paint off the bulkheads, and loosen the fillings in your teeth. If the skipper is a tough man, he knows within a few seconds whether his boat is really hurt or not. If it isn't, most sailors consider themselves released from the promises they recently made to their God, under duress. The skipper of a cornered sub faces a grim dilemma in deciding how he will try to escape. If he stays near the surface, his sub is easier for the sonar operators to find and easier to hit with depth charges. But he is under less water pressure than if he goes deep, and if his pressure hull is cracked. He may have time to blow all tanks, surface, and give his crew a chance to escape before she sinks. If he goes deep, he will be much harder to find and much more difficult to hit. But he loads his hull with tremendous water pressure. A mere tap from a depth charge too far away to hurt him at a depth of 10 fathoms may crack his pressure hull at 100 fathoms. Then, even if he pulls the plug and blows all tanks, the water may gush into the pressure hull faster than the air can expel it from the ballast tanks. In that case, they all go down, 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 until the sea pressure crushes them flat, and the end is like a beer can full of flies that gets run over by a truck. When the increasing screw noises and sonar pings told Lowe that the corvette was almost at the firing point, he ordered full speed on both motors and put his rudder hard over, hoping to run out from under the depth charges while they were sinking to their set depth. Half a minute later, hell broke loose all around them. The ocean trembled, great blows smashed against the hull, and the men were thrown against the sides of their steel cigar like dice rattling around in a box. For a few seconds, discipline and panic scuffled with each other inside every man, but soon panic was overpowered and shoved back into the depth of his subconscious. A few seconds after the battering subsided, the reports were coming into the control room. No serious damage forward. Engine rooms okay. Lowe kept on at full speed for 10 minutes, and then reduced to a creeping speed again. For about 15 minutes after depth charges ripped the ocean apart, reverberations, eddies, and gas bubbles disturbed the water so that a corvette's listening gear is useless. Her sonar man, straining his ears for telltale noises, cannot pick up the sound of a U-boat's propellers over the rumbling and re-echoing that goes on in the depths. During his 10-minute speed run, Lowe had moved about a mile from the scene of the attack and was still down at 600 feet. As the ocean began to quiet down, the sub's sound man was straining his ears too, and soon he reported, "Propeller noises medium distance." A minute later he said, "Propeller noises decreasing," and all hands took a deep breath and grinned at each other. At last, they were indeed members of the inner circle of combat seasoned U-boat veterans. That night, Lowe wrote in his log, "Baptism of fire. Crew behaved excellently." But he didn't seek any more trouble with that particular steamer and her escorts. He remained submerged for 2 hours after the screw noises died away, then surfaced and moved off to the south. Next day, Lowe made a nice little gesture to his crew by dipping down across the equator for half an hour. No sailor is considered a real shellback until he has crossed the line, and they all like to brag of having done so. In his war diary, Lowe records, "Appropriate ceremonies were observed, modified to meet existing conditions." Even in the midst of an all-out war, seafaring tradition required the proper difference be paid to Neptune, who is supposed to board every ship that crosses the equator in search of unfortunate landlubbers who have not previously made their number with him. After another uneventful week, Lowe hit the jackpot again 2 days in a row. On the first day he entered in his war diary, 4-3, 2132, steamer West Irmo, Amerikaner, 5,775 BRT. This ship was escorted by 2 corvettes, and Lowe had to stalk her for 29 hours before he got her. He missed her once with 2 torpedoes, and neither she nor the escorts even knew it. But when he hit her, he had to slink away and elude the escorts, so he actually didn't see her sink. He claimed her only as a probable because he had heard the torpedoes hit, and 10 minutes later heard the unmistakable noises produced when a sinking ship was being crushed by the pressure in the depths of the sea. Next day, he got a Hollander, the SS Alfaka, 5759 BRT. This one was a sitting duck, unescorted. He plunked her with 1 torpedo early in the evening in a surface attack, and then stuck around for a while to gossip with her crew and the lifeboats. He notes in his war diary, "Boats well equipped and provisioned. Crew spoke German. Upon parting, we wish each other good sailing. Irony of war. We fight against men who speak our own language." 12 days later, the U-505 started back for Lorient and had a comparatively uneventful passage. One day, she had a brush with an aircraft that dropped 12 bombs around her in the course of a couple of hours, but they did no harm, although the first one must have been close to her just as she was submerging. They later found a fragment of its case on the conning tower. 400 miles out of Lorient, they were again attacked by aircraft, but crash-dived in time to get nothing but a shaking up from the bombs. 2 hours later, Lowe received a radio from Dunitz, telling him an inbound sub had just been attacked in his exact position. Evidently, the Germans were reading the coded reports from RAF aircraft over Biscay at this time. Lowe comments on this dispatch: "Fast intelligence work." On May 7, the U-505 tied up in Lorient. On her maiden cruise, she had sunk 26,000 tons of Allied shipping. A pretty fair record even in the banner year of 1942. Actually, it was close to the general average of all U-boats at sea during the 92 days that she was out. Some did better, but for a new sub on her first cruise, to equal the average was a very credible performance. She fired 14 torpedoes, of which 8 hit. She sighted 7 possible victims and got 4. She crash-dived to avoid aircraft 24 times and was only bombed twice. She had felt depth charges exploding close enough aboard to expose any weak sisters in her crew, and none had been shaken out. One very significant statistic of this cruise, showing how well the war at sea was going for Germany at this time, is the summary of miles steamed. 12,937 surfaced, and 316 submerged. This means that the U-505 traveled 40 times as far as a surface vessel as she did submerged. Since subs were primarily surface craft, it indicated that at this stage of the war they were able to operate in accordance with their nature and limitations, and explains why Germany sank over 7 million tons of Allied shipping in 1942. The comment of Admiral Dunitz's staff on the U-505's war diary for this cruise was, "First mission of captain with new boat. Well and thoughtfully carried out. Despite long time in operations area, lack of traffic did not permit greater success."